So I would say that the sci-fi is more apparent than the fantasy simply with just the aesthetic. We have.
Hey, McBride, welcome to the show.
Hi, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Likewise. So, your first book, Vessels of Core Conquest, is inspired by both fantasy and sci fi. How do both of those genres play into the book's development and overall story arc, or arcs in this case?
So I would say that the sci-fi is more apparent than the fantasy simply with just the aesthetic. We have like space travel, science fiction future, advanced technology, all those tropes that people are used to. But fantasy takes a role in the more supernatural elements of the story, um, dealing with some more Lovecraftian entities, right? So it's not all just it's not a more typical um, science fiction story. The fantasy elements creep in when we get into certain characters and elements that are, you know, less scientific. And when I say less scientific, I mean entirely spiritually inspired and mechanically functional in that sense. Uh, but yeah, it's fantasy because it's a little bit supernatural.
I think I kind of jumped the gun by accident. Could you explain the premise of Vessels of Core Conquest for those who don't know? Because I don't. I think it's fair to say it's not. Don't mean to insult you, but it's not a
No,
well-known book.
no, it's not. It's not. Like, I'm just an indie author, so I'm not exactly, hitting the New York Times bestseller list. So, my book, Vessels of Cor Conquest, essentially follows multiple smaller stories inside the novel, and it's broken up with different stories with different titles, and in that sense, it's a bit of an anthology. And every story follows a different person across the future, and at the beginning of the book, in the first little short story, it's explained that the reason why the book is formatted this way is because of the character Core, who is essentially watching over different humans over history and learning through them and through their experiences with the villain, who is a supernatural entity. He learns through them and has to eventually face against this threat at the end of the story. So he learns how they defeated this villain by how they mustered the positive aspects of mankind, and he uses that as his motivation to protect humanity in the end.
Could you describe what an anthology is for those who don't know? Because I don't. Most books aren't even written as anthologies. They just take one central storyline and just run
Mhm.
with it from start to finish.
Correct, yeah. So an anthology is essentially a collection of a bunch of short stories that make up one large arc. So they usually have some kind of connection either at the end or some commonality between them. For people who have maybe seen the movie Trick or Treat with like the little Sam kid that with the bag over his head, for those of you of them watching that have seen that, that would be an example of an anthology where it's not following the same characters constantly, but there's some commonality in the sense that it all takes place on Halloween, or in my book, it all follows Core and the villain Legion and his forces. So that's the factor that's connecting all the stories together.
Would you describe an anthology as a collection of novellas? Because I know those are typically 17,000 to 40,000 words, but an anthology is just that, but multiple novellas.
It certainly could be described that way. For me, specifically, it's a bit of a mix of some novellas, but also some stories that would frankly be too short to even be considered novellas. So some of them are really short and sweet and kind of just get the point across, like the very first one that just sets the stage. And then we have other ones in the story, like Voice of the Abyss and others that are much longer and expand on the individual character arcs for a longer duration, and those would be considered novellas just because of length, but it doesn't have to be novellas specifically.
So you could mix it up a bit if you wanted
Mhm.
to. How much creative freedom does that give you then? Because if you, like you said, you can mix it up,
Mhm.
obviously it lets you go, oh, it doesn't all have to follow A, B, C, D, E. But there's
Yeah,
obviously going to be constraints with that. So what are the freedoms or what are the constraints?
I like to focus on the freedoms first, because that's definitely what kind of got me into the rhythm of writing, and that's what really got me excited about this, is that you don't have to you don't have to constrain yourself to a certain setting. growing up, I was always a fan of like big universes like Star Wars. Recently I've been really getting into Warhammer 40K. So I like a big universe, right? So having a bunch of smaller stories allows me to explore different areas, different time periods in this fictional setting, and also showing us different perspectives. In the beginning of the book, which takes place at an earlier time, we kind of see a bit of a golden age for the Nebula Empire. By the end of it, we start to see people are doubting its stability. And even just little comments like that kind of show how things have changed in the wider world. So a major freedom is just being able to explore more ground, as opposed to showing just a microcosm of a world, right? But of course, it comes with its share of constraints. The big one I would say is just frankly the audience. A lot of people don't really read anthologies. A lot of people don't really love the idea of having to jump around stories. Some people love it, but a lot of people, they just want to pick up a book and they want to enjoy a simple story. They don't want to have to worry about all the background information that could muddy it up. I would say that's a pretty major constraint for sure.
I suppose as well, it makes it harder to keep track. But I know you set Vessels of Core Conquest to over a 400-year period, so I think it's fair to say it's easy to keep track in that regard. But then there's inevitably going to be massive time loops. You're not going to go every single year. You'll be there forever.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, even though it takes place over 400 years, we're not going every single year. And when we do have a story, we don't start with like a whole summary of all the history, because the reader doesn't need to know these things, right? We just need to know what's relevant to the story. So, for example, in the beginning of Seraph of Damnation, which is the last story, we just meet our human characters. They're on a colony on Callisto, and that's it. We explain who they are, what they want, and we show that through characterization. We don't need to know what's going on Mars, for example. It just doesn't matter.
Yeah, because at that point it's redundant. Oh, Mars is doing this. Yes, is this central to the main plot? No, let's move on. Would you say Vessels of the Cord, as a premise, is integral to the overall like fate of the universe type of situation, since it's so embedded in the main worlds and main story? It's not like a slice of life type of narrative, but the only one that comes to my mind is Goblin Slayer, which is, yeah, you've got the big central
Mhm.
world, but we're following a single character who's on a single quest. Would you say Vessels of the Core, of Core, keep saying of the Core, like everything depends on Core defeating Legion, as opposed to like, oh, if he defeats Legion, meh.
No, it's very important. So Legion is essentially, I should probably explain who Legion is. Legion is essentially the universe itself given a mental capacity. And the reason why Legion is trying to destroy humanity is because across Legion there are these artifacts that, if triggered incorrectly, could result in the universe collapsing and then being reborn, leading to a time loop. And Core is here to essentially stop the time loop from keep going over and over again. And to accomplish this, he needs to he needs to stop the human that triggers the reset by finding the artifact. And then he also grows attached to mankind, just like his father who created him, the anomaly. He doesn't want this species that he spent time with throughout his lives, throughout his vessels. He doesn't want them to go away. So he tries to ultimately protect them from Legion's forces that are trying to wipe them off of the universe, fearing for their own safety.
What are some of the logistical challenges with writing a time loop, or is that something that kind of you wrote it so that it didn't really happen?
So yeah, I didn't really write it so that we see a time loop. That would certainly be an interesting challenge for me, and I'd be open to it one day perhaps. But um, essentially, it's just kind of explained that at a certain juncture, which we see later, the universe would have reset it, and the same exact events would have happened. But Core's intervention stops that. So we don't really go into the mechanics of a time loop and time travel and all that.
You said in, was it the Writers Realm podcast? I think I've got the name right. Core, when you were developing the book, Core himself, well, as a character, came very late in the development, and then you just tied all the stories together. A, why did you decide to do that? And B, why did Core come along later in the book's development?
So what's interesting is that when I was first getting into writing, I had this universe in mind that we would later see in Vessels of Cor. but I didn't like how they weren't related. There was no reason to be invested, and I also found myself written into a corner because without some kind of supernatural intervention, the universe would just reset and it wouldn't matter. The same thing would just happen for all of eternity. So that's when I knew I needed to introduce this character Core, and I went back into all the other stories and added his notes. But for most of every story, you wouldn't actually realize that he was even present because he's not mentioned. He's not even there. He's just viewing the stories of the characters just like the reader. He's just kind of seeing their experiences and learning from them. So he came along later. I always had the idea kind of in the back of my mind for his father, the anomaly that is essentially the sole constant of the universe. He's the only thing that remembers the fact that there's a time loop. Even Legion doesn't remember this because every time the universe resets, there's a new consciousness, a new universe that takes control and remember and starts its memories all over again. But the anomaly is the sole constant, and then he creates Core, his son, to do to stop this loop from happening.
Would you describe Cause more of a spectator?
Yeah, he's absolutely more of a spectator, but what sets him apart is that in the end he's forced to act and to protect what he has learned to enjoy. I think a lot of people in a way could relate to this. You see people getting in heated debates over their fandoms and things, and it's because they want to protect something that they care about. Core kind of sees humanity in a similar light. We are storytellers, we are characters in this on the canvas of the universe, and he wants to see us progress instead of falling on our faces again and again and starting over just to fail again. And yeah, so he's absolutely a spectator, but he does need to grow, and he does need to ultimately take a stand against what he loves.
As you were saying about that, we were all storytellers. I kind of reminds me. Have you ever read The Science of Storytelling by Will Storr?
Can't say I have. No.
No, it was a really good book for anyone who's interested. Basically, there's a bit at the beginning which says, as humans, we evolved to communicate via stories. And when I read it, I was like, oh yeah, we do, because when we tell our mates or friends stuff that happens, we always describe it as a story. And I think if you're looking at something as a spectator, you're kind of witnessing or hearing that story play out in a way. You're just taking more of a back seat. I think Core, as you described, the character, he definitely does that. What were some of the logistical challenges with writing anthology?
Logistically, it's difficult to come up with fresh ideas instead of just repeating the same kind of story over and over again. But honestly, back when I was writing this, I just had so many ideas. I actually had to end up narrowing it down. There were stories that I wrote completely unrelated to the universe, just as like for fun, and then there were also some that I wrote in the universe that ultimately never made the final cut because they just weren't relevant. There was one I had that was called The Sultans of Titan, but it didn't involve Legion. It was an interesting story and I loved it a lot, but it had no relevance to the overall plot and it didn't make it in for that reason.
Yeah, didn't you have 12 stories originally, and then you cut it down to the five?
Yeah, so there were 12 stories. Most of them were short horror stories, believe it or not. And so those were removed fairly quickly simply due to the fact that they were unrelated to the plot as well as the genre. But they were a lot of fun, and so some of them ended up making it onto my website as something people could just read for free if they were to visit me over there.
No, that makes sense. You don't want to have different themes contrasting or clashing with each other.
Exactly. It felt like it was just like whiplash back and forth. We'd have, like a story about a guy, in a cabin in the middle of Kansas, and then the next story we're out in space fighting with, advanced weaponry, and it doesn't make any sense. So, yeah.
And then you're on title with a bunch of sultans. So,
The Sultans, it was the name of a creature that lived on the planet, and not Arab sultans.
okay.
Yeah.
It's always very interesting. Here's a fun question. If you could have vessels of how do I keep saying vessels of the why vessel of core conquest get turned into a film, who would you want to playing each character, and who would you want directing the film?
That's a very good question. It's not something I can say I've thought about simply because I'm just an indie author, right? Who's gonna find this thing? But that's a good question. I would have to say that Core would be we would need to find a very adept voice actor because of course he's not a human. He looks radically different from us. So having someone's iconic face wouldn't do much justice because it's covered in makeup the entire time. Um, I don't know. I can't say I've ever thought about that, so I can't really give you a concrete answer of who should play certain characters. But a lot of it would be reliant on the voice acting as opposed to the actual faces, because the human characters we do meet don't stick around. So, it's just because we have multiple sets of human characters, so they're not going to be there throughout the entire duration. So it's hard for me to say who should and should not uh, be included in that. That's a tough one.
Would you say it would be a cast of B-list actors if a lot of the characters died, or would it be a mixture of A-list and B-list?
I would say B-list would honestly be better, simply just because, I don't simply because, like, looking at this from a marketing standpoint, people tend to get disappointed if a major actor's in a movie and then they get killed off in the first 10 minutes. That's just something that I've seen, which is just silly because, I mean, that's you're not watching the movie for the actors, you're watching it for the plot. But that's how people respond in this day and age to these things. So yeah, that's a really tough one. I'm not much of a filmmaker myself. Like, video making is something that I dabbled in back in high school, but it's not something that I pursued professionally. So I don't feel like I have the authority to speak on what that would look like.
Yeah, I got a filmmaking background, is what kind of associated with this podcast, but I know what you mean. It on paper, it sounds like, oh, let's turn this into a film, but you get to the logistical side and you go, who's going to play you? You've got a sequel for Vessel of Core Conquest coming out. Isn't it going to be called Vessel of Core War?
Yeah, so the idea that I have is that's gonna be called Vessels of Cor War, because we're following the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So first is conquest, then war, then famine and pestilence. Um, right now, in full transparency, that's kind of on the back burner for right now. People grow, and I'm no exception to that. I started writing this book when I was 16, and I published it when I was 18. Coming up almost 2 years later, people have changed a lot. My worldview has changed a lot, and I don't want to write a story as of this time that is going to be so virtually distant thematically, and in relation to its tone. I think it's going to be a bit jarring for my readers. So right now, that's just going to be sitting on the back, but I'm still absolutely writing. I'm not going anywhere with that. But I'm just working on stuff that speaks to me personally, and I think that that's just kind of the message that's trying to get out. And it keeps bringing me back to the brainstorming table, because uh, you know I, I've been trying to come up with something new for a long time. Like, we're talking years, and it's been starting over and over constantly. But when you have something that's so important to you, and so important to you spiritually, I mean, it's going to find its way out, so that's what's happening to me right now. And I just finished an outline for a new story, but I haven't started putting, words in a Word document. We're still very much in the infancy of this thing, but I'm very pleased with it so far, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with this thing.
Do you find I've been working on a side project myself, which I came up with when I was 21, and keep in mind I'm 25, still working on this. Do you find when you're working on the same idea for a long time, you look back and go, I kind of wish I didn't, because yeah, because you've changed so much, and you look back, I kind of wish I did something else, or I kind of wish I did this differently, because like you said,
Mhm.
you've grown and developed so much. It kind of the original idea that you had on in your head or on your mind, it doesn't fit with who you are now, and you're kind of just doing it to get it done.
Exactly, and that's why I put Vessels of Cord down for now, because frankly, it felt like a job. It didn't feel like a passion or an art. And I'm like, no, if I'm gonna force this out, it's gonna be crap. Simply put. If it lacks the soul, if it lacks me, then it's no different from putting it into Chat GPT and making it write it for me. Like, you can have something written, but it's not gonna be human. It's not gonna feel the same. So, but looking back, for as hard as I am on myself, I can look at Vessels of Core, and I can recognize that that is probably like the best thing I could have done with the experience I had at the time. And knowing that I could do better now, and that am doing better now, I'm like, that's good. It doesn't have to be seen as a defeat. And it's not gone. The Vessels of Core isn't gone forever. It's going to come back. It's just I need a break to kind of sort out my writing and among other things going on in life. I'm 20, in college still working. I mean, these things take up time and you need to set your priorities straight. And, doing something that you don't enjoy isn't how you should spend your limited time on Earth. It's just not.
No, I get that. It's what you're going to allocate your resources to, or can you at least make it enjoyable down the line? That's how I look
Hmm.
at it. Because the unfortunate thing is, you're not going to enjoy something all the time. So, is there a way you can make it enjoy? If you can't make it enjoyable now, if you make it enjoyable later?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I've with certain writing projects in the past, I've tried to like retool them and you know and and refine them to be something that aligned better with what I was looking for at the time. A problem I've run into is that you have so many passions, you have so many ideas, and you can't just set it all straight. And when you try to put them all together, you just end up with an overcomplicated mess. Um, so a lot of it just kind of comes down and frankly that was one of the reasons why I liked the short stories is that I could move from different passions. I can move from different stories and plots and characters. Like one of my favorite characters appeared in one of my favorite characters in my book appeared in the story called The Servant of Space, and he was an interesting character that went on a bit of a redemption arc after serving Legion, but that's the only story he appears in, and it's because he wasn't needed elsewhere after that. But that story, Servant of Space, was one of the last to be conceptualized, and it's because I had an idea for a new character. I'm like, I really want to get this in here somehow, and I found a way. But if I tried to, shoehorn him into another story, it would have ruined the whole thing. So that was one thing I appreciated about the anthology structure. Writing, a single focus novel definitely has its challenge in that regard, that you have to stick with it. And if you try to butcher it to fit in your new ideas, you might run into a dead end. You might end up just kind of ruining it. But sometimes you have to make that call of, do I want to stick with this old thing that works, that doesn't excite me, or do I want to try something else? And I can't always give people an answer for that. It just depends on what you feel and what you want to do with that. Um, it's a tough challenge, sure, but it's a decision everyone has to make when doing this sort of thing.
How did you maintain? You're saying about not shoehorning characters in for the sake of it. How did you maintain consistency along the five short stories of your book?
I think I maintain consistency by being inconsistent, by having those different stories. I could include so many different things, if that makes sense. Instead of having to stick you know, with Peter from the first story and having to keep him along the entire time, it would have felt wrong. His arc was completed early in his story. He didn't need to stay around. He didn't. Um, so by having all these different kinds of arcs, but separating them, I don't have to grow up the whole arc of all the characters together, of a group of people that meet in the beginning of the story and grow together. This time, it's one after the other in their own problems, um, with the villain to kind of tie it all together. And that's Legion's function ultimately, is to kind of, in a way, bring everyone together by threatening to tear them apart. So I hope that answers your question, but it's definitely more of an abstract answer for sure.
Sounds like what you've got is a bunch of short stories, and Legion's just this one massive thread that connects them all over a 400-year period.
Correct. Yeah, Legion is pervasive. He's gonna keep coming back, and in a way, Legion represents, nature in its most raw form. You can't escape it. It's always going to come back. You have to, find meaning within yourself. You need to find meaning amongst your fellows to overcome those negativities. So yeah, so as a villain, yes, he's just a threat that wants ultimately to just wipe out mankind, but it's what he poses as a threat conceptually and philosophically that I think makes him a villain worth fighting, you know, fighting against.
What are the themes of the book then?
There's a lot of themes, because of course it depends on the individual story. In the first one, it's about learning to stand up for what you believe in. It's we follow Peter, who in the golden age of the Nebula Empire, on a foreign colony that has a very tight state to ensure peace on this remote area. He finds himself kind of straying a little bit, but he follows what he believes in because that's what ultimately he feels would bring peace to his people, and he accomplishes this. In another in another instance, that that commander, that alien commander that I mentioned earlier from the Servant of Space, a theme tied to his arc is redemption, and that it's never really too late to do the right thing. I'd say that the overarching theme across the entire book would simply just be to to see value in the immaterial things, right? To have value you know in what makes you, you know, what makes us human, and to see how that's valuable. You can't, it's not worth a certain price. I can't say, like my emotions are worth a certain price tag. It's not, but it's worth that it's worth so much more to me. Uh, and so that's what it's really about. It's about recognizing our own worth and what we can not only do for ourselves and for our own lives, but also how we could improve the lives of those around us, and how we can work together to make a positive world for for everyone.
Actually sounds quite nice the way you've described it. Currently, Vessels of Core Conquest is exclusive to Barnes& and Noble. And now, I know you said in another interview that you were planning on bringing it to Amazon and other platforms. What have been some of the logistical challenges, or just challenges in general, with getting your book on other platforms?
Honestly, the major challenge is just it all comes down to me. It's purely an oversight on my behalf. There's no one else to blame for it. Going through college, working, these things take up time. At the end of the day, when I'm tired and when I've worked all day, I don't want to think about it. I just want to put it down. And also, there's a part of me concerned with further spreading and promoting this book that right now its future seems a little uncertain. It's like I said, like Vessels of Core War has been sitting on the back burner. I don't want to let people down, I guess. I don't want to spread this any more than it I don't want to spread this to people that will feel disappointed if it takes me a few more years to get this next book out. I mean, listen, I'm young, I am 20, but ultimately, people's attention spans don't last very long. So I think the main problem has just been, logistically, it's just been tough with juggling everything else on my plate, and emotionally, it's been a challenge because I just I'm just uncertain about its future at this time. And even though I know it's going to be back, I know it's gonna have a future. I don't know what that future looks like quite yet. And making big promises, I think, is a little imprudent at this time.
Would you also say that when you get shows and they end on a cliffhanger and everyone's like, where's the next one? Never comes out. It almost sounds like you're doing the opposite, where there's a cliffhanger, but you're not telling anyone about it, so they're not, the audience isn't going, where's the second book?
I've had people ask me about the progress of the second book. I've had people that I've met that have read the book and met me through my book, and they've asked me what's gonna happen to the next one, and it hurts to not have a concrete answer, but I do know a vague idea of what's gonna happen. At the end of the book, we kind of set up the fact that Legion has just decided to just completely invade the solar system. It was the last straw. Humanity found an artifact that he didn't want us to find, and even though crisis was averted, he wasn't too happy about it. Um, the universe had always reset prior to the events of war. The universe would have reset at the end of Conquest, and so now war would be the new event, and it would essentially be the universe trying to punish mankind for um, for challenging their own fate. And with themes like that, it takes a certain level of trepidation and meticulousness to craft it in a way that's appropriate and to craft it in a way that is rewarding to the reader. And as of right now, it's a little tough because I have too much on my plate, and I just need to set my priorities straight and let other things sit for a little bit of time, while also improving my own talent in this craft as well. I'm a younger guy. I can still improve so much with this art form, and ultimately, I think the weight will be a positive thing. I mean, ultimately, there are so many media, there's so many forms of media out there. There are so many universes to invest in. People will be okay. I don't think, even though there are people that are waiting with, and asking me about the future of this story, we're not we're not worrying about it's not life and death, is what I'm saying. Like, we'll get there and it'll be good, but I want to give it time so that it is good.
Now I get that. Who was it that said this? A delayed video game's a lot better than a video game that's rushed out. It sounds exactly the same philosophy with the sequel. It's you rather delay it to actually have it be good than I was just getting out for the sake of it coming out because yeah, people want a sequel.
Yeah, and that's also kind of why I've like shut up about it on social media a little bit. It's kind of why I haven't been promoting it as much, because ultimately, why bring more attention to something if they're gonna have to wait God knows how long for the next one, you know? Um, that's why the stories I've been working with in the meantime, they've all been standalone. Like, there's no sequel necessary. They have their story and that's it. And it's because, frankly, I like having something wrapped up in a neat little bow. There's a part of me that is against the idea of having any more stories, especially starting a new one with vessels, with vessels on the table. Nothing I write will ever have a sequel to it. It will always ever be Vessels of Cor that will have the sequels lined up.
I agree with you. If I was ever write a book, unless I might tease there might be a sequel, but I leave it up in the air. But maybe there is, maybe there isn't. It doesn't really matter either way. But I do think the problem with books having sequels is that A, there's a wait time between each sequel, and B, is where you start off from. Because I've been reading the Artsy Crowshaw's Jack Mikiru trilogy. Now he's brought the third one out on Audible, but I'm kind of sat waiting. Well, I read the sequel in 2023. We're almost halfway through 2025. Where's the paperback? You know what I mean? It's like I'm just sat waiting
Hmm.
for the sequel or the last book, and I'm like, can I just read it, please? Besides putting Vessels on the back burner, what are your upcoming writing projects, or is it you just gonna primarily focus on making sure that Vessels of Core War actually has the time and space for it to be written properly?
I'm giving Vessels of Core its space for now. It's one of those things for me that sometimes when I step away from something, that's when my best ideas come out. It's sometimes it's random. So as much as, even though I have ideas with Vessels, I just kind of need it. I kind of need to let it be for a minute. Um, so right now, what I'm working on, we have some things that are a little bit different in its tone. We have some things that are a bit darker and that wouldn't be appropriate in a Vessel's book. Not inappropriate in the sense that it might be, like upsetting. I mean, inappropriate with consistency. So I don't want the first book to be so optimistic and then the second book to be pessimistic. Even though the second book will be about war, there should always be a light at the end of the tunnel. And frankly, what I've been really into as of late is, writing kind of inspired by like your pre 80s and pre 70s sci-fi literature, where it's almost a bit of a social commentary. Things like Make Room, which inspired the movie Soylent Green. Um, Things like that, where it's a bit of like a social commentary as opposed to a flashy method of entertainment. So it's, as I said earlier, in our chat, about how people change so much, and with that, your voice is going to change in your writing, and so that's kind of what I've been expressing, is just a new voice that doesn't belong with Vessels right now. So we're just going to kind of see what happens with Vessels, but it's absolutely not done. I don't have any intention of giving up on it permanently. Absolutely not.
One last question, a bit off topic, but you did a talk at, I think it's Supine School to Middle Class,
Yes.
yeah, about
Mhm.
creative writing. What was it like to give a speech to, well, essentially inspire and teach the next generation of authors?
I mean, it was incredible. I've actually done a talk there twice, to a creative writing class, and both times have been incredible. I prepare fresh material every time. It's great to see their voices heard, and I think it's so important to give people, young people who want to do this. I think it's so important to give them a platform and an environment where they feel like they should be sharing, and like they should be proud of what they're sharing, and while also giving them some pointers and help guide them along the way. Yeah, it was always such a rewarding experience, being with them and talking with them, and because it's just a discussion, like we write a little something, we share, we talk, and it's always been a lot of fun every time.
Tim McBride, everyone. Where can people A, find you, and B, get your book?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram, author_McBride. My book is currently available at Barnes& and Noble, and you can also find a link to that Barnes& and Noble listing on my website, that is vesselsofcor.webador.com. There you'll also find some short stories I've written that are completely free for anyone's reading pleasure.
Thank you for watching. If you like author-based content, then I know you will like Kevin L. Michelle's episode right here. Go on, give it a tap.